Welcome to This Week in South Carolina. I'm Gavin Jackson. Election Day is now less than a month away, and many South Carolinians have already voted absentee. We bring you the latest from the debate stages of the 1st Congressional District and the U.S. Senate race. But first, the latest from this week. Absentee voting got underway this week as thousands took precautions to cast ballots in person, including Congressman Jim Clyburn in Orangeburg on Monday.
I think it's important to vote earlier simply because you never know what's going to happen on Election Day. You may not even be around on Election Day. And according to all the court rulings, once your vote is cast, it's counted.
In Lexington County, the line of mask-covered voters moved quickly, and there are plenty of open machines inside.
You tend to try to vote what affects your household financially. But in our situation, we wanted to vote on choosing a leader that's going to represent all people and not just a certain select amount of people. Even if it does affect how profitable I can be overall with my income.
I voted Republican for Donald Trump. He's the best president we ever had. And if you vote for Biden, you're going to be up the creek because it's socialism and everything else. So I think Trump's the best one that you could vote for.
Voters also weighed in on Senator Lindsey Graham in his tight race.
He actually started out against him, but I think as he went along, he's for the president and Republican Party, and I like Lindsey. And he has done some good things for the country.
I think we need his experience in there. So.
Had a wonderful conversation with him and respected him as a leader, respected some of his stances when he, would not go party line. I don't recognize that person anymore.
Joining me now to discuss the latest on the campaign trail in South Carolina is Meg Kinnard. She's a reporter at the Associated Press, and Jamie Lovegrove with the Post and Courier. Welcome to you both. Welcome back.
Good to be back.
Thrilled. It would be nice to see you back in person, but
yes.
This is a good close second.
It's glad to have you guys both on at the same time. This is something new for us, so we appreciate y'all making time. I want to talk about the Senate debate. I want to talk about SC01 in a moment, but first, kind of want to lead off with some news that we saw recently come out about ratings for the Senate race. We saw from a Cook Political Report that the Senate has now moved from lean Republican to toss-up. This is how they're rating it, saying it's become more competitive. Meg, we've gone, through this whole cycle. We've seen it go from solid Republican to now a toss-up. What does that mean, and what is driving this move?
Yeah, we've seen this race tightening over recent months, and I think it's a confluence of a bunch of things. For one, we're finally in that part of the year of the campaign cycle where people are actually paying attention to this. Some of them are watching debates, but all of them pretty much, if they're anywhere near a television screen or a computer, are seeing ads from the candidates, from the groups supporting them and opposing them all over the place. So there's just a lot more airspace, both literally and figuratively, being taken up by this campaign. And so as people are called about the candidates to do some of these polls, they may actually know a bit more than they would have a couple of months ago. But aside from that, we really are seeing just so much attention in general, media-wise as well. This race is one of the closest, really most closely watched ones across the country in terms of the battle for control of the United States Senate. And we're really seeing that reflected in these polls that are coming out in South Carolina. And those really drive a lot of those moves, like we saw with the Cook Political Report this week. And Jamie, to kind of tag on that, we're talking about advertising. We're just seeing bunches of money come into this race. Kind of give me an idea about like what that is looking like when we're talking about the millions and millions of dollars approaching 100 million, and then just how the polls are really shaping some of these things like Meg is talking about. We see these tight polls. What's your read on those and the money coming into this race?
Yeah, I mean, you cannot understate just how much money is coming in at this point. As we wrote last week, we're looking at going to be north of $100 million, most likely, total spending in this race when you add both of the candidates, as well as an increasing amount of outside money that's coming from groups that want to get involved because this race is suddenly very close. Both Democratic groups and Republican groups are now coming in and running their own ads separate from the candidates. By comparison, I mean, the most expensive race in South Carolina history before this was the 2016 presidential primaries from both parties combined. So you're thinking Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, and then all of those Republican candidates who were also running that year. Every single one of them combined spent $42 million. So we're going to be well over double that in this race. For a statewide race in South Carolina, we're way, way, way beyond anything we've ever seen. So, yeah, it's going to have a huge impact. It means that, these candidates are able to be omnipresent in every voter's lives right now, even though they can't be on the campaign trail. If anything, they are more present than they would be in a normal election cycle when they are out and about meeting small groups of people, but they can't be broadcasting to folks all over the state, which is what they're doing right now. So it has totally changed the dynamic of this race compared to anything we've ever seen in South Carolina before. And, it means that that the candidates are able to, they don't have to face us as often. They don't have to face voters' questions as often. They're able to portray themselves in the best light possible. They are able to have this kind of filtered lens in a way of which to show them and their backgrounds, and also to attack each other, which is, of course, what a lot of these ads have been, particularly over the last few weeks.
Yeah, and I want to throw out a number from Cook Political Report saying that Jamie Harrison, the Democrat, has reserved or spent time through Election Day on TV and digital ads upwards of $60.3 million. And Graham, meanwhile, has spent or reserved $20.6 million so far. So just astronomical amounts of money here we're talking about. Yeah. And just, Meg, when we talk about this race, I have family, I have friends all over the country asking me, what's going to happen? Is Jamie Harrison actually going to be able to beat Lindsey Graham in this solid Republican state? I want to get your take on what you're telling people when they ask you that for your prediction. I know we're all burnt on predictions and polling, especially from 2016. But what's your take? What are you telling people when they ask you, what you expect to see on November 3rd once polls close?
I remind them that this is South Carolina we're talking about, and it's 2020, so anything is really possible. But clearly, we're going to continue to see these ads. We're going to continue to see these prognosticators who are weighing, who's going to win this election. Let me look into my crystal ball. Let me look at this political report. We're going to continue to see those coming out. Honestly, none of it matters until voters actually vote, which they are now, by the way, since we've all seen that getting underway this week. But we have to remember, regardless of the polls, regardless of these ratings, South Carolina has not sent a Democrat to any office that is in a statewide capacity in more than a decade. So that is just something that we need to keep in mind. Republicans occupy all the statewide elected offices here, most of our congressional delegation, and both chambers of the legislature. That notwithstanding, clearly there are some waves of change sweeping across other parts of the South. And because of changing demographics and many other factors, South Carolina could very well soon be part of that, but perhaps not exactly right now here in 2020. We just need to keep all that context in mind when we look at these polls, which obviously have been very good for Jamie Harrison, but they may not necessarily directly be a reflection of exactly what voters are going to do.
And Jamie, kind of piggyback on that and tell me your take. I mean, we're talking about a toss-up race. We're seeing other Senate races in neighboring states also being labeled as such. But again, like Meg was saying, our neighboring states are a little bit different when we talk about this changing demographic that we've been seeing play out over the country over the past few years.
We haven't really seen a Republican candidate in South Carolina go so aggressively for an exclusively base strategy. Senator Graham basically decided 3-4 years ago that Trump was the future of the Republican Party, that he had to get on board, and that he was going to become one of his closest friends. And he has used that relationship to get some of the things that he wanted, both for South Carolina and particularly on foreign policy. Of course, Senator Graham is someone who cares very deeply about foreign policy, and he's often in the president's ear on that issue. But as a result, his coalition is radically different from the one he's had in prior elections. When he won by 17 points in 2014, his biggest challenge, of course, was the Republican primary, because there were folks on his right who didn't like him. And then, of course, there were folks, there were plenty of Democrats who also didn't like him, but there were a lot of moderate Democrats who did vote for Senator Graham. They really considered him to be a moderate compromiser, someone who was willing to work across the aisle. Of course, his relationship with John McCain, the maverick played into that. And now that has totally changed. I mean, there are very, very few Democrats who are willing to cross the aisle for Senator Graham. And meanwhile, he still has this much smaller but still there contingent of folks on the far right who still are a little bit skeptical of him. They still remember that he voted for Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan, two of President Obama's Supreme Court nominees. They still remember he was a member of the Gang of Eight and tried to compromise on immigration. They haven't forgotten what he said about President Trump during the 2016 campaign, even though he has now become one of his closest friends. And so he's kind of squeezed on both sides a little bit at this point. And that's kind of why he is in a much trickier position than we've typically seen for statewide Republican candidates in South Carolina. His approval ratings, if you just compare them to other statewide Republican elected officials, are lower than everyone. Mm-hmm. I mean, that is a problem for him that is unique to him right now. It's not necessarily just a broad changing of South Carolina. He is uniquely vulnerable to a challenge like this. And Jamie Harrison has capitalized on that.
Yeah, definitely looking forward to talking to voters. I was out in Lexington County. I talked to some, asked them specifically about Senator Graham's evolution on stances and positions over the past few years especially. And a lot of people just say that's politics. That's what these politicians do. So they're not too surprised. I'm looking for those voters who are going to vote for Trump and also not vote for Lindsey Graham or leave it blank. That's something I think we're all going to be interested in hearing from. If you're not mistaken, Meg, what do you think there? Just really quick before we get into the Senate debate.
Definitely. President Trump assumes that South Carolina is safely in his win column as it was in 2016. But you're right. For Jamie Harrison to win statewide here, there would have to, if you do the math, likely be some voters who are going to pick President Trump, but also wouldn't then be picking Lindsey Graham. So trying to cleave those voters away from the Republican incumbent, that's a difficult task for a Democrat, and that's a big one that's on Jamie Harrison's plate.
And I want to switch to this.
Gavin,
go ahead, Jamie.
Can I add real quick?
Yeah.
One thing that's been interesting about that is we started to see a number of ads from Democrats that aren't about Jamie Harrison. They're about Lindsey Graham, and they're trying to create distance between him and Trump. They're pointing out when there have been positions that Trump has taken that Senator Graham has disagreed on. They're up with billboards reminding people about what Trump said about Graham in 2016. Those ads are not designed to win support for Jamie Harrison. They're designed to peel away support from Trump supporters for Lindsey Graham.
Different tactic, a lot of tactics at play like we're talking about here. But Jamie, I want to talk with you about the Senate debate. We were watching the first Senate debate. Both you and Meg were there last week at Allen University. Kind of tell me a few of the takeaways there besides the plexiglass partition, which obviously, made the ripples, I think maybe to the VP debate stage last night. But what were some of the big takeaways in that first matchup we saw between Jamie Harrison and Lindsey Graham? Like you were saying earlier, we haven't been able to see these guys on the campaign trail because of the pandemic, and they are being a little bit more tight-lipped, especially Jamie Harrison. And I want to talk a little bit more about what you've heard from him recently. But tell me what stood out to you on the debate stage on Saturday night. Jamie.
Me? It was a remarkably competitive battle, I thought, because of the fact that, this was really the first debate that Jamie Harrison has ever participated in. He did do some when he was running for DNC chairman in 2016. But Senator Graham is, he's been on a presidential debate stage. He has run for office many times before. He's very experienced in this. He considers debating to be one of his biggest strengths. And in fact, when he ran for president, one of the few highlights that he had were some of those debate performances. Jamie Harrison came in there and he was not fazed by that, which, we have seen for other sort of first-time political candidates, political newcomers who get pretty nervous on the debate stage when they're going up against someone who's much more experienced than them. And he was kind of able to stick to his message. Senator Graham really wanted to draw him into fights over the Supreme Court, wanted to draw him into, conservative social issues. And Jamie Harrison really stuck to what his core messages are, which are healthcare and the coronavirus pandemic and the way that that all of that has been handled. I imagine that's probably what we're going to see for the next two debates too. Is Jamie Harrison believes that if voters think that this election is about the coronavirus pandemic, and this is what Democrats across the country believe, right? We saw this last night in the vice presidential debate too. If it's about that, then Democrats are in a strong position. But, conservatives care very deeply about the Supreme Court. There are a lot of conservatives in South Carolina. And if Senator Graham can make this race about that, and that's certainly what he's going to try to do when he has the confirmation hearings next week, then he's going to be in a much stronger position. So it was interesting to watch that kind of dichotomy. And
definitely, Meg, I want to get your thoughts on what you saw on that debate stage. You just heard Jamie kind of talk about how Lindsey Graham has prided himself on being a big debater in the past, but I think I don't know, maybe he wasn't expecting Jamie Harrison to come out swinging as hard as he did, or, he just seemed like it took a minute there for Graham to kind of get his footing and get stable. I know there were some audio issues, but I was expecting a little bit more of a forceful opening from Graham and going forward. And I know he probably has a lot going on with his mind. The president just had COVID diagnosis come through, and then, of course, he's dealing with the judiciary. But what stood out to you, and how'd you weigh their performances?
You know, one thing that we've talked about a lot, and I've included in a bunch of my stories lately, is that moment in during the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation process in 2018, when we saw Lindsey Graham emerge as this fiery defender of one of President Trump's nominees. And it was that passion that kind of created this closer relationship between Lindsey Graham and President Trump. And that's something that voters have told all of us. I really think back to that. And that's what kind of did it for me in terms of showing me as a voter that Lindsey Graham could be this classically conservative Republican that I need for him to be as a South Carolina voter. We didn't see that Lindsey Graham at this debate. And I think that that was one of the most surprising things, just kind of, optically speaking, for us to see. Yes, Jamie Harrison is a strong debater, as we learned. I didn't know exactly how he was going to perform, not having seen him in that role very often. But Senator Graham, in just about every answer he gave, he did bring it back to the confirmation process, at which he's obviously going to be at the helm of that this next week when those hearings get underway. But yes, obviously he was very forceful in terms of describing the ways in which he is prepared to continue along the path of creating and fomenting a conservative judiciary on behalf of President Trump. But his whole kind of demeanor toward making that argument wasn't as fiery as we remember from the last confirmation process he participated in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you almost heard more fire from Jamie Harrison, really kind of holding him, using his words against him, like we've heard him say so many times about those judicial appointments during election years. Jamie, talk about the judicial confirmation process next week that we're going to see. Some people are calling this a Hail Mary for Lindsey Graham at this point with these tight polls and this money coming into the race. Obviously, we kind of talked about how things might work out, but just what role will these hearings play when we're going to have Senator Lindsey Graham, have the Judiciary Committee front and center for multiple days on air? And of course, these hearings will be bookended by with campaign ads in between. So it'll be an interesting thing to watch. But what are you watching for next week, and what will these hearings mean for this race?
Well, to start with, I mentioned earlier this kind of small contingent on Senator Graham's right that is still a little skeptical of his evolution to become one of President Trump's greatest supporters. This is his core closing argument to them is going to be, look, I am doing this. I am going to bat for President Trump and going to bat for conservative judges. As Meg mentioned, his moment defending Brett Kavanaugh was really what brought him to this kind of reputation to begin with. And now he has an opportunity to cement that. And, this time, unlike with the Brett Kavanaugh situation, he is going to be the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. He is going to be overseeing these hearings. He was just a member back then, a high-ranking member, but Chuck Grassley was the chairman at that time. And so, he is going to get an absolutely insane amount of earned media attention. We talk about paid media, which is all these ads that are going on TV, and Jamie Harrison is destroying him on that front. I mean, he is multiples ahead because of how much money he has raised. But you can't pay for the type of earned media, the type of press attention, the type of cable news attention that Lindsey Graham is going to get next week when he is chairing these hearings. And to be, at that front and center could potentially be an advantage to him. But it will, of course, also remind those who dislike him and dislike what he has done why they dislike him.
Mm-hmm. And Meg, any thoughts on what we're going to see next week at the Judiciary Committee hearings?
If voters like what they see, it's going to be great for Lindsey Graham because he is going to be in the spotlight and have a lot of attention on him. If for some reason, and who knows how this process goes, but if there's a moment that a voter looking at that who hasn't quite made up their mind sees it and says, you know what, that's not the kind of guy that I want representing my interests, that's not going to go well for Lindsey Graham. Mm-hmm. On behalf of Jamie Harrison, though, I've talked to him about this and said, look, you're basically going to have South Carolina to yourself here in some of the closing days. He feels good about that and intends to, use that space and time here in the state among the voters who can actually vote in this race, not all the viewers seeing these hearings nationwide. He feels good about the opportunity that gives him in the closing weeks to really continue to make his argument to South Carolina voters.
And Meg, really quick, I want us to wrap up the debate, but we saw some glimmers of, a type of Lindsey Graham out there on the debate stage. We saw some glimmers of his bipartisan years, even bringing up his, support for Obama SCOTUS picks, saying that I have the scars to prove it. He even referenced his nickname on talk radio, Grahamnesty, when talking about immigration. Is that to his detriment? Is it that he's reminding some of these voters that might not like him, like Jamie keeps talking about, these, this small contingent of far-right people that don't like him? Or is he just trying to show that he still does have the ability to work across the aisle in a time when it seems like it's impossible to do in Washington?
I think that some of that is Senator Graham's response to people who have criticized him for being a complete flip-flopper, from going from the senator who was working with people like John McCain and Democrats on Capitol Hill to get things done, from going to that toward this foot soldier of President Trump that some would like to portray him as. But that in and of itself seems like it might be kind of another flip-flop when you go back to the previous attitude that people have criticized you for moving away from. Regardless, he's trying to appeal to some of those voters who are in the middle, who may be Democrats who've previously supported him because they like his message and they felt that he could kind of, toe that bipartisan line between conservatives and Republicans here. So that's who he's trying to appeal to. But as we've seen in some of these polls and just from the voters we've talked to, there's very few people who really occupy that space here in South Carolina still.
Jamie, we have about 5 minutes left. And I want you to spend maybe just less than a minute on a conversation you had with Jamie Harrison recently. With your newspaper and Pints of Politics event you all hosted. What did you find out from candidate Harrison? Anything specific? I mean, you guys spoke for an hour, which seems, kind of unheard of these days, like we're talking about access to these candidates. But anything that stood out to you, anything that, newsworthy that you found out during that discussion?
Yeah, we got an hour, but, frankly, by the time it was over, there was still a bunch of questions I wanted to get to. But we tried to get as much as we could. And on this topic, I'd say this was probably one of the more newsworthy parts, was these questions about the Supreme Court. We asked him, if the shoe was on the other foot in 2024, would you vote to confirm Biden's nominee? And he basically said that the Republicans are setting a new standard now. So, yes, Democrats should vote to confirm a Biden nominee in an election year. I did say, so does that mean if the Republicans don't do it this year that you won't? He said yes. So he's he's putting it on the onus for them. He did express opposition to a number of proposals that some Democrats have floated, including packing the Supreme Court, i.e. increasing the number of Supreme Court justices and ending the filibuster in the Senate, which requires 60 votes for a lot of major legislation. He says he thinks that those norms are kind of important to protect and they're there for a reason. But he did, also say that he supports abolishing the Electoral College in presidential elections, and he suggested it should be a popular vote. He also suggested that he supports D.C. statehood, which could radically change the dynamic in the Senate. It could add 2 more Democratic U.S. senators. So there are some norms that he wants to protect. There are some that he is willing to upend, and I thought that was a particularly interesting part of our conversation.
Meg, I want to switch to the 1st Congressional District. We saw the second and final debate between incumbent Democrat Joe Cunningham and then also Republican State Representative Nancy Mace. It seemed like they sharpened their talons a little bit more in this last debate we saw this week. I just want to get your thoughts because we heard more about Donald Trump in this debate than the one that Jamie and I co-moderated together. Does that work in anyone's favor? It seems like they're all trying to walk a very fine line, especially Joe Cunningham when he's trying to, sell himself to those moderates out there in the 1st Congressional District.
Joe Cunningham is in a tough spot, as we've talked about, and as everybody knows. I mean, he flipped that district, the 1st district in the Charleston and Beaufort and Hilton Head areas. He flipped that in 2018. It had been in Republican hands for a very long time. That doesn't mean that everybody who lives there is all of a sudden a Democrat. There are a lot of Republicans who are still in the 1st district. And so, yes, he's going to have to try to continue to make the argument that he can represent both Republicans and Democrats in Washington and, make it clear that he's not just going to do whatever Nancy Pelosi wants him to do. He's mentioned in these debates and plenty of times in the past couple of years that he didn't support Nancy Pelosi when she ran for House Speaker and that he has disagreed with her on some points. Nancy Mace, on her side of things, is quick to point out the percentage of how often Joe Cunningham does support Nancy Pelosi. So we're seeing both of these candidates really kind of taking a national lens on this race, which, I mean, that's not just them. There are plenty of national groups who are also pouring money into this race to try to win it back on behalf of Republicans or keep it for Democrats. But President Trump, even though he's not part of the 1st district necessarily, is certainly playing a role in that both candidates are having to realize that he may have plenty of popular support in that area, and they also need him to be supporting their candidacy for the 1st district congressional seat.
Jimmy, tell me about Trump's role, like Meg was talking about, in the 1st Congressional District race right now. We even heard Joe Cunningham talk about the COVID relief bill and how the president was, pulling against support for it and trying to walk a fine line there, as well as on some other topics facing those voters.
Yeah, it was interesting that both candidates, frankly, kind of danced around Trump a little bit in this most recent debate. While Congressman Cunningham did criticize him, somewhat for ending those coronavirus relief negotiations. He could have gone a lot harder. Some Democrats have criticized him much more vigorously than he has. And Nancy Mace, who, especially during the Republican primary for this race, really emphasized her ties to President Trump, pointed out that she worked on his 2016 campaign, pulled back a little bit on that and did not emphasize that as much this time around, which is interesting given how badly President Trump did win this district in 2016. He won by about 13 points. So, clearly both of them don't necessarily want to make this race all about him. I imagine it's going to be a lot closer than it was in 2016 at the presidential level in that district. And both of them, I think that they will need to outperform the top of the ticket in order to win. And so they are really trying to emphasize their own credentials at this point.
Gotcha. A lot to watch over the coming weeks as we're just, a few short weeks away from Election Day. I want to thank our guests, Meg Kinnard with the Associated Press and Jamie Lovegrove with the Post and Courier for this great insight. Guys, I'm sure we'll be catching up with you all soon. Thanks again.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Gavin.
To keep you updated throughout the week, check out the South Carolina Lead. It's a podcast that I host that we've been dropping multiple times a week to keep you updated on the latest news from the campaign trail to the COVID-19 response. You can find that on southcarolinapublicradio.org or wherever you find podcasts. For South Carolina ETV, I'm Gavin Jackson. Be well, South Carolina.